Good evening, everyone. Good evening and happy Tuesday. I want to thank everyone on behalf of the Angelina Pedroso Center for Diversity and Intercultural Affairs. I am Dr. Doreen I. Wheeler. I'm a professor here, and I am very pleased and privileged to be here with you all this evening with this wonderful host of beautiful people. I want to thank Dr. Gibson. I'm going to turn it over to her in a few minutes. She's going to give us some words of welcome. Want to thank Valentina Camboa Turner, our new interim director of the Angelina Pedroso Center. Shout out to her. Awesome, awesome. And we got Mr. Tim Mays back here with us doing spoken word. Woo! And our new executive director for equity, diversity, and inclusion, Dr. Shireen Rashanavan. I want to thank her. And I also want to let you all know that we have a new staff member, coordinator of LGBTQ plus and Indigenous peoples, Ms. Fawn Pochel. So give a shout out for her and thank her for being here. And always grateful and thankful for our student workers, our student leaders, and our students, period, because without you, there would be no us, there would be no purpose for us being here today. Before we get started, and I turn it over to Dr. Gibson, we want to do a land acknowledgement. So I ask you to bear with me as I read this to you. I acknowledge and recognize the Indigenous peoples who live and have lived in the area now called Chicago, Illinois. The people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Adwa, Chicago, and Lake Michigan are sites of trade and healing for dozens of tribal nations, including the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Winnebago, and the Sauk. Indigenous people have migrated and cared for this land and water for millennia. Today, Chicago is still home to one of the largest Native populations in the nation. We have a responsibility to acknowledge these Native nations and to work with them as we move forward as a vibrant, inclusive institution. We want to recognize that we cannot separate the history of our university or our community from the history of colonialism and slavery in the United States. This legacy persists today as we continue to work towards racial justice, equity, liberation, and community here at NEIU. So if you could just give me 30 seconds of silence to acknowledge our Indigenous brothers and sisters and our ancestors. Thank you. And before I turn it over to Dr. Gibson, we want to thank all our co-sponsors. All of them are so wonderful. We want to thank the President's Office. We want to thank Student Leadership Development. We want to, y'all have to forgive me, my little phone went off. We want to thank El Centro. We want to thank African American Studies. We also want to thank the Jacob H. Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies. I am so glad we have continued our partnerships, and all of you who have helped behind the scenes that we may have forgotten your names. We know you've done something. We know you're there for us, and we appreciate you. And without that, I will give it to Dr. Gibson.
Thank you very much. I do want to officially welcome everyone to our event this evening. I'm glad that we are here, even though it is virtual, but we are here together to celebrate this very, very special occasion and a very special speaker. Thank you, Dr. Cheney, for spending time with us. It is always important to listen and to learn. So I am really looking forward to your talk this evening. I want to also thank everyone who participated. It takes all of us working together, each person doing their special role, their special part. And again, we seek excellence, we seek service to our students, especially, as Dr. Wheeler said, to our students. So I want to thank you all for being here. And the last thing I would like to say is that this program and other programs at Northeastern continue in the legacy of Martin Luther King. And we continue to focus on equity. And I don't know who's listening this evening, but I want to let you know that NEIU has a special scholarship. And this scholarship is to address equity. And if your family makes $60,000 or less, and you have a 2.0 GPA, and you're a first-time full-time freshman for fall of 2022, come to NEIU. No tuition, no tuition. So I have to give a plug out because this is our way, one of the ways in which we address equity at NEIU. Thank you, thank you, thank you all for being here this evening. And let's listen and learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gibson. Always a pleasure to see you and have you here. Now, this young man that I'm about to bring for y'all, most of us know him. This is our son, this is our brother. Home, Tim Mays, and come home. We love you. And now I'm gonna officially read his bio. Okay, but I had to do that because I haven't seen him in a minute and I love him and miss him. And he is awesome. So we are in for a treat, y'all. So Tim Mays is currently serving as Organizational Development and Engagement Manager at Metro Rail. Formerly, he served as the Assistant Director for Black Student Engagement at Northeastern Illinois University in the Angelina Pedroso Center for Diversity and Intercultural Affairs. A teacher at the Antioch High School in Antioch, California, and he received his master's in higher education from Loyola University in 2016. He continues to dig deeper into his research around exoticism, disposability, and the healing of Black bodies. Timothy recently released his first poetry and affirmation book entitled "And Still I Rise to Fantasize," which attempts to channel Black resilience in the face of consistent trauma while having the unwavering courage to strive toward being holistically well. All right. Timothy has devoted himself to making sure that people from low-income communities are prepared for and comfortable with the possibilities of advocating for themselves to ensure the true sense of community is accomplished. Without further ado, Tim Mays, you have the mic. Woo!
Thank you, Dr. Willer. It's always a pleasure to be back, like Dr. Willer said, back home. Connecting with students and faculty and staff and administrators at the university. But as you all know, my interest in doing this work is always about the students. And I know that the folks on this call sharing that in that feeling of really caring about students and doing the work for students. So tonight, what I'm gonna share 3 pieces with you all. And these pieces I really wanted to pull from a place of honesty. So I pull from 3 different parts of my life. So the first poem is a poem that I wrote when I was actually 17 years old. And it kind of shares and it speaks, all of these poems share and speak to this idea of freedom. And I think with my various different identities as a Black male, and the various different places that I've gotten to experience, this idea of freedom has looked different in all of those spaces. And so you'll kind of hear that as we go through the poems and the pieces. And so I won't spend too much time talking and explaining what the pieces are, but you'll hear that through those themes. So there's first piece that's about that I wrote when I was 17. The second piece I wrote while I was in undergrad. And then the third piece I wrote while I was just about a year ago. So it's fairly fresh and new. So you get to hear 3 different perspectives. I also wanted to share before I started, Valentina and I did a lot of work around solidarity. And so we'll get a chance and opportunity to continue that work, starting with this MLK Solidarity series, in which the Angelina Pedroso Center will be kicking off. And we'll really be interrogating and digging into the work of solidarity. And so I also wanted to share the fact that I also be kind of coming back to the university, so to speak. I'll be working in the nest with students starting in February. So there'll be a great opportunity to connect with students. Again, it's about the community, and it's about, you know, helping folks get to the next level, whichever level they want to get to. And so I hope you really connect with what we're going to be doing and how we're going to be building that out. And I hope you enjoy these pieces that I'm going to share with you tonight. So. The history books we read indeed tell good stories, but never showcases the faces of those who came down from glory. We had hopes for better here, and every year I see the spirits of young people blowing in the wind like the paper we used to parade our passion on, and now we walk the streets and can't even recognize the feet that got us here. Every day I wake up in an attempt to stand on the shoulders of men like Martin Luther King, because too many Black boys have laid at the feet of police deceased without reason. Another family is broken because bullets blast out of guns from pawn shops and hit kings and queens in the chest while the devil moves strategically across the board yelling, checkmate. A cold game this is, a cold game this is, and we watch from the bleachers, believing that our children only learn what they learn when in classrooms and in front of a teacher, but they learn more here. It's like war here, because every day there's a memorial service for the veteran or those who didn't know any better then and never got the chance to be a hero. But this is what happens when our dreamers forget how to dream and people with low self-esteem keep quiet. And this is what happens when our sons pick up guns and run from affection because a father wasn't there when he needed a little bit of protection. And with so many of our men in the prison system and each second contributing to the past, it feels good to say, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. All right, so this next piece, thank you. So this next piece that I want to share is called The Zoo. And it really kind of continues on in that vein, in that phase of thinking about freedom, what freedom is. And why I wrote that first piece is because I really wanted to challenge us to think about the capacity that we have and what space we hold. You know, some of my family members and friends weren't fortunate enough to, you know, escape being incarcerated, and I was. And so I think about the responsibility that I have to advocate for them because they can't advocate for themselves in the space that they're in. So I challenge all of you all to think about the space and the capacity in which you take up in advocating for those who have been marginalized and continually marginalized. So I'll share this poem. This next piece is called The Zoo. Zoos have all the best animals. It's the one place we can go to see all the different species that we will otherwise only see on TV. They've got lions, chimpanzees, birds with colorful beaks, and butterflies that makes me think that God tapped into his inner child when he created them. The last time I went, I saw an elephant lift a tree trunk with the snout, saw a koala bear eat a snail, make a funny face, then spit it back out. I was having a good time until the little boy next to me asked the question that would unearth the oldest tree. He asked, why does everything from Africa always end up in cages? My world is now silent. Can't help but feel how humble the wind blows on the back of my neck. When you are staring at your reflection in the plexiglass home of 100 wild things, common and familiar are the last words you expect to mumble. But I've learned that in this world, people will tap the glass of the box that they put you in, taunt you and snap your best photos when you look your most aggressive. Freedom is as fake as the habitat we call city. Even being Black and non-threatening is a cage of its own. You have to act a certain way, think a certain way, look a certain way, express yourself a certain way, I swear. These days, I find myself on the perimeter of local neighborhood ciphers, trying to quit hip hop like cigarettes, wishing I could rock on and yes, y'all, but spitting 16 bars, spitting 16 bars, spitting 16 bars, spitting 16 bars, spitting 16 bars sounds counterproductive to my quest for freedom. Sounds like oxymoron, sucking the oxygen out of a gas chamber. Sounds like metaphors behind metal doors. Sounds like similes that make words, zoos, and prisons seem similar. Sounds like I realize I only wear the gifts that look good on me. Sounds like I ain't as free as the animals I paid to see. And as I stand here on this stage, using an art form that will be associated with my intellect, attempting to look more parrot than pigeon, do I look more exotic than the other brown boys? Tell me, do I put on a good show? Tell me, am I worth the purchase of a ticket? Tell me why it is that we believe that prisons have all the worst people, that it is the one place you can go to see all the different species that you will otherwise only see on TV. They've got murderers, drug dealers, thieves, and innocent men draped in brown layers of guilty, and it makes the rest of the world think that God had nothing to do with our creation. Tell me that this is not true. Tell me that this poem made you think about what it really means to be free. Tell me that I'll make it, since you cannot tell me why everything from Africa always ends up in cages. All right, so that's piece number 2. And I just wanted to share a really quick one that kind of, I think, culminates the pieces, right? So there's this idea of, me kind of going through my progression in life. And so I had an opportunity and a really great opportunity to teach these young men who oftentimes, in a lot of cases, wanted to be artists and wanted to be hip hop rappers and things of that nature. And so oftentimes I'll find myself challenging them in a loving way to think about all of the different pieces and things that they might potentially run into. And so I wanted to share this piece with you. It's just a short, quick piece, but I just want to share with you and hopefully you'll connect with it. I heard a rapper say it's all about money and dollar bills. I wonder if he thought about how Jim Crow feels or what it means to own the rights to your masters. As the descendants of a chattel slave deep in Alabama, I told him, there's a light that shines brighter than a diamond. King saw the mountaintop, we gotta keep climbing. We rise and then we rise again. Searching for hope but can't find it. That's when I tell them better look into my eyes again. Nothing for self because it's for they soul and they soul. Looping in my consciousness, I hear the words of J. Cole. They can never fix it, putting money on a payroll, praying for the strength I need to buckle down and stay whole. Because all we want to do is take the chains off. All we want to do is break the chains of pain. All we want to do is be free. All we want to do is be free. All we want to do is take the chains off. All we want to do is break the chains of pain. All we want to do is be free. All we want to do is be free. Thank y'all. I appreciate the time. It was lovely to connect with you all again. I'm looking forward to connecting with the students and continuing our work in solidarity. And I want to say happy birthday and celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was so powerful, so powerful. I feel like I came to church on the meal in the middle of the week. Like, woo, that was powerful. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you our speaker of the night. Dr. Sharice Cheney is the Director of Black Studies and Associate Professor of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of Oregon. Her research interests pivot on Black popular culture and political cultures, Black nationalist ideologies and practices, and gender and sexuality. Her work complicates dominant cultural narratives of Black social movements and interrogates the constructive and disruptive ways that Black people have been defined, Black power in the 20th and 21st centuries. Cheney's first monograph, Brothers Gonna Work It Out, Sexual Politics in the Golden Age of Rap Nationalism, situates the politicized rap music of the late 80s and the early 90s within the historical tradition of Black nationalist thought. Today's talks features excerpts from her second manuscript, Blacks Against Browns, the Black Movement Against School Integration in Topeka, Kansas, 1941 to 1954. Blacks Against Brown documents Black Topekans' conflict over the city's Jim Crow education system. Blacks Against Browns is a community study that uses interracial struggles over Topeka public schools to demonstrate how racial geography shape histories of white domination and Black resistance. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Cheney. And one quick thing, we do not have chat, we do not have raised hands. Put your questions in the Q&A box and they will be attended to after her talk.
Thank you all for coming today and for inviting me. I'm going to take a moment to pray for my internet capabilities. You know how sometimes it goes in and out just when you need it the most. I especially want to thank Dr. Rashan Ravan for inviting me today. So once a year, the nation turns its attention to a social justice icon and his political legacy. Martin Luther King Day offers a moment of reflection upon where we were, where we are, and where we want to go as a nation. These continue to be trying times for all. The global pandemic has exacted a devastating toll on BIPOC communities. Fatal violence against African descendant people continues to be an epidemic within the pandemic, as does gendered violence, racialized gender violence against Indigenous women, women of African and Asian descent, and Black transgender women and gender non-conforming people. Meanwhile, states' rights to disenfranchise Black voters through racially targeted voter suppression laws are fortified by Congress's inability to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. Climate apartheid affects the lives of and livelihood of BIPOC communities both locally and globally. The list of racial violations goes on and on. Annual MLK celebrations invite us to shed light on the ways that marginalized and minoritized communities stage interventions on dehumanizing forces like white settler colonialism, white supremacy, or heteropatriarchy. Over the past 10 years in Black communities throughout the US, political resistance emerged in the form of Black activism, including highly publicized Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, and Me Too movements. At colleges and universities across the nation, Black students demanded inclusion and an end to anti-Blackness in classrooms, on campuses, and in communities. Black study scholars studied the historical legacies of the carceral state and engaged in debates over Black sociality and Blackness as social death. They joined ethnic studies scholars to challenge the encroachment of conservatism and threats against academic inclusion in the name of critical race theory. Resistance to essentialize Blackness is also evident in the work of Black creatives like visual artists Kehinde Wiley and Carol Walker, and musical artists like Lil Nas X and Megan Thee Stallion. Black communities contain a multiplicity of experiences relative to ethnicity, gender, sexuality, generation, and region. Sometimes that diversity lends itself to conflicting imaginings and performances of Black futurities. There are many Black Americans in my generation who embraced NWA's gendered racial subversion in Straight Outta Compton, but who clutched their proverbial pearls at the racialized gender subversion of Thot Shit or Montero. But that same internalized fear of Black sexuality informed the political exclusion of freedom fighters like Claudette Colvin and Bayard Rustin. The historical invisibilizing of people like Rustin, Colvin, and Marsha P. Johnson, who don't fit a particular political narrative, is a failure to imagine a freedom for all Black people, providing a different context for or reinterpretation of King's oft-quoted statement, "We must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools." In my own research, I explore Black conflict over Topeka's Jim Crow schools in the decades before Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. It provides an opportunity to examine how class and color inform Black political subjectivities and perspectives. When I speak about my work, audiences are surprised to learn that most Black Topekans preferred all Black schools during the 1930s and 40s. That is because the hidden history of Blacks against Brown disrupts a meta-narrative about one of the most significant moments in America's racial history. When the Topeka NAACP began its desegregation campaign against the local school board in 1948, many Black parents, educators, and alumni actively engaged in an obstruction of justice. In the historical shadow of Brown versus Board, Black resistance to school integration occurred at one of the most surprising times in one of the most unsuspecting places. But it is important to note that Topeka's segregated elementary schools had comparative resources, equitable facilities, similar curricula, as well as compassionate, qualified, well-paid Black faculty and administrators. Black elementary students had an affirming educational experience in all Black schools. Black students transition into racially integrated junior high schools, particularly was a hostile experience and a legitimate cause for concern for Black parents. So when the local NAACP mobilized against segregated schools in 1941 and again in 1948, Black school advocates fought vehemently to maintain all Black schools. They believed that the price paid for freedom would be too high. If it had not been for the resilience and resourcefulness of 3 local NAACP members, there would have been no Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. The hidden history of Blacks against Brown calls attention to the fact that people who have been racialized as Black are not monolithic, nor are our political strategies. This is particularly important when learning about the modern civil rights movement. School integration did not signify racial progress for all African Americans during the Jim Crow era. In Topeka, before Brown, there were conflicting definitions of educational justice. Proximity to whiteness was never the goal. It was a question of imagining a just Black future. In order to understand Black resistance to integrated schools in Topeka, it is vitally important to recognize the temporal and spatial dynamics that informed Black Topekans' political activism during the mid-20th century. My first objective in my work is to study the symbiotic relationship between race and space. As my esteemed colleague Laura Polito insists, geography matters. White domination and discourses of whiteness vis-a-vis Blackness have regional and local specificities. These distinctions are rooted in particular histories of settler colonialism, immigration and migration, and slavery or proximity to the enslaved. Over 80 years ago, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his philosophy of race segregation, contended that individual and collective Black subjectivities are deeply influenced by racial geographies, and that they inevitably produce multiple political practices and discourses that are sometimes contradictory and in conflict. Such was the case among Black Topekans in the pre-Brown era. Proponents and opponents of school desegregation were not only positioned in opposition to each other, but also against white segregationists. In fact, Black school advocates provide an opportunity to explore African-American political practices that both collude and collide with white domination. Their opposition to school integrationists was a public stance on behalf of Black children that also aligned with the public stake in whiteness as property. Although their interests converged with the white school board, Black school activists desired an internally defined racial separation, not an externally imposed racial segregation. They fought to preserve safe, anti-racist educational spaces that nurtured the psychosocial and cultural development of Black students. Like many places in the American West, racial restrictions in Kansas were complex, inconsistent, and elastic. The true legacy of Bleeding Kansas was not white racial enlightenment. It was an internal conflict over the limits of Black freedom. From the post-Civil War period to the post-World War II period, white policymakers legislated both civil rights and racial segregation because they favored political equality over social equality. Kansas state laws regarding public education were a primary example. In 1861, statute only permitted school segregation in cities with populations over 15,000, as long as the local school board secured equal advantages for Black and white school children. Segregation in high schools was permitted throughout the state. The Topeka Board of Education complied with the state's legal parameters. Since it was unable to maintain parallel schools for white and Black students, the board had an optional enrollment policy through the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. So some Black students went to all Black schools while others attended their neighborhood schools that were integrated. That racial flexibility changed in 1929 when a dual education system became economically viable due to the passing of a bond. So for the next 20 years, that's 1929 to 1949, the Topeka School Board semi-successfully operationalized the separate but equal Plessy standard. Therefore, the NAACP's desegregation lawsuit was radically different from the other ones that were subsumed under Brown. Black school children in Topeka did not experience overcrowded classrooms like those in Washington, D.C., nor were they subjected to dilapidated school buildings like those in Delaware or Virginia. And while Black parents in Delaware and South Carolina petitioned local school boards for bus service, the Topeka School Board voluntarily provided buses for school children, for Black school children. So the roots of anti-Black racism in Topeka help to explain the divergent anti-racism strategies of Black Topekans. So when the Topeka NAACP launched its desegregation campaign in the late 1940s, it struggled to mobilize Black residents. Unlike in many Southern localities, Black reluctance towards or resistance to NAACP efforts did not stem from Black fears or anxieties around a white backlash. The Topeka School Board's anti-Black racism inadvertently subsidized Black resistance to anti-Black activism or anti-racism activism. Because its privileging of whiteness did not include a divestment in Black schools, the board created the schools that the board created to enforce interracial exclusion unintentionally fostered intraracial inclusion. By creating a parallel school system for Blacks, the Topeka School Board facilitated economic opportunities for Black educators, ensured instructional parity for Black children, and it reinforced racial pride in Black communities. In addition, to make matters better or worse, all Black school children in Topeka matriculated from all Black elementary schools to predominantly white junior high schools and senior high schools. And that transition from a familial learning environment with compassionate Black faculty and administrators into racially mixed schools with indifferent or racist white faculty and administrators, that transition was harsh and alienating for Black students. Black school alumni and resident Richard Ridley stated, "It wasn't the grade schools that sunk me, it was the high school." The nuances of individual and institutional racism in Topeka public schools complicated Black political projects in relation to educational rights. When civil rights proponents successfully pursued legal intervention against segregated junior high schools in 1940, Black parents and educators launched a counter movement. Following the 1941 Kansas Supreme Court decision in Graham versus Board of Education of Topeka, the school board fully integrated its junior high schools despite organized Black opposition. Tensions between pro and anti-desegregation activists remained so high throughout the 1940s that the local NAACP consciously avoided the issue of segregated schools. But when McKinley Burnett was elected president of the local branch in 1947, he set his sights on the city's remaining Jim Crow schools. Within months of being elected, he appeared at a school board meeting and demanded the full and complete integration of both pupils and teachers in 1948. Membership in the local NAACP plummeted. Historians fail to question the motivations of civil rights activists because the ends justify the means. But the fact that they were a minority voice in a minoritized community calls into question historical assumptions about Blacks before Brown. Not only was there no unified Black unified front, but more Black Topekans advocated for race-based school policies than protested against race-based school policies during the 40s and early 50s. In Topeka. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka was the culmination of a decade-long struggle of a few local civil rights activists. But that small cohort of NAACP members kept pushing against all odds, even when at odds with most Black residents. Their dogged determination deserves some explanation. Now, without suggesting causation, there is a clear correlation between the corporeality and the consciousness of the Black Topekans who were for and those who were against Brown. The architects of the desegregation campaign, McKinley Burnett, Daniel Sawyer, and Lucinda Todd, were all fair-skinned. The Burnett family could pass for white, and the Sawyers were listed in the 1910 and 1920 federal censuses as mulatto. Their destiny was bound not by class or color, but by racial inheritance. By contrast, the most vocal advocates for the city's all-Black schools, Harrison Caldwell, Ezekiel Ridley, and Mamie Williams, were prominent dark-skinned educators with no illusion of inclusion. It was not uncommon for Black Topekans to reference the phenotype and physicality of Harrison Caldwell and Mamie Williams when discussing their accomplishments. In fact, Mamie Williams, her intelligence was often juxtaposed against her skin color and her hair texture, exposing Black internalization of the interrelated systems of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. But complexion was not the only connection among pro and anti-school integrationists. The civil rights activists were native-born Kansans, firmly situated in an elite, if not elitist, social circles in Black Topeka. These not white but light Black Topekans' demand for equal access was unequivocal and undaunted by other Black residents' concerns about interracial learning environments, Black teachers, or the community at large. On the other hand, many of the outspoken proponents of all Black schools were the children of Southern migrants who articulated their racial uplift politics through race pride, racial self-determination, and bourgeois respectability. So as we commemorate Martin Luther King's birthday, it's important to ask what, in fact, we are celebrating. More Americans are more familiar with these spectacular marches and protests than the multitude of anti-racism mobilizations that occurred in various localities inside of and outside of the American South. But as we bear witness to Black protests in the face of white violence in the past, we must remember that the fact that the fight for social change and racial justice in Black communities was dissonant, diverse, and divergent, even then. It is important to complicate and broaden our understanding of the modern civil rights movement, including the person and politics of Martin Luther King. While King's 1963 March on Washington speech is on constant replay, it is important to remember that his dream did not align with that of other freedom fighters like Malcolm X, Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, Stokely Carmichael, and others. There is another critical question at play during this national holiday, or yesterday's national holiday. We know who we are commemorating, but for whom are we commemorating? The formalization of MLK Day is less about Black politics than it is about white optics. There is a national desire to reproduce American racial mythologies invested in a linear evolution from racist evil to racial good. Consequently, the radical nature of King's vision is neutralized in these annual national celebrations. He once said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." What can white allies learn from that profound statement? Just as it is important to complicate the experiences of people of African descent vis-a-vis anti-Black racism, I think it's also important or critical to shed light on the diverse emergences of whiteness. So here in the Pacific Northwest, histories of anti-Blackness originated in a history without Blackness. Oregon, for example, was the first state to be entered into the Union with an exclusion clause. So white racial subjectivities in this state evolved in the relative absence of Black people. The racial legacy of the Pacific Northwest was evident in the violent eruptions that happened during the summer of 2020 in Eugene, in Portland, in Seattle. The nation bore witness that summer to a crisis of whiteness. Unlike other regions where whiteness has been dependent upon a distancing from Black bodies, Here, it was manifest in white divisiveness over Black bodies in the absence of Black people. Relative absence of Black people, I should say. So as historian Ibram Kendi says, to effect change, we need anti-racist whites, not racist whites. This fall, I was asked to write an essay for a publication called The Conversation. An 11-year-old New Yorker asked a question: how did white students respond to integrating schools? Now, her question was particularly timely considering that New York schools are now the most segregated in the nation for Black students and the second most segregated in the nation for Latinx students. But to answer to her question, the answer, of course, is that white response varied. Most Americans recall white resistance in places like Boston or Little Rock, Arkansas. In fact, one of the most iconic photos of violent resistance to desegregation was taken at Central High School on September 4th, 1957. Arkansas Democrat photographer Will Counts captured a 15-year-old white student named Hazel Bryan yelling at a 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford as she was turned away from Central High School by the National Guard. The picture quickly spread through national news outlets, and Bryan became the symbolic face of Southern white racism. However, there is another lesser-known story of whites' response to integrating Black students that day. Perhaps more important than the collective of white students who mobilized outside of Central High School that day was the white majority of intentionally disengaged white students. While Bryan and her cohort became a public spectacle, the inaction of the silent white majority went unnoticed. Even sympathetic white students avoided assisting Black students because they deemed it too socially risky. One white student said she was ashamed of her peers' behavior outside of school that September day, but she did not want to get involved. Another student admitted at the time that she was more interested in high school dances and athletic events than the emerging political storm. It was a privilege that was denied her new Black classmates. As an adult, that student, named Marsha Webb, expressed regret for her unwillingness to intervene. In her words, she acknowledged that, quote, hurt can come from words, but from silence even, from just being ignored, unquote. The more things change, the more things stay the same. George Floyd's murder in 2020 signaled another racial reckoning. Over 50 years after the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., extreme acts of racial violence present us with the challenge of squaring who we are with where we come from and where we want to go. Much like the second Reconstruction of the 1960s, we are living in a historic moment of radical possibility. The catalyst for this moment is not only anti-Black racism, but the collective action and creativity of Black people in the US. Hopefully, history will not repeat itself. We cannot afford to go backwards. But Generation Z gives me great hope. On the streets and through social media, many have stood up against white supremacy and white settler colonialism, patriarchy, homophobia, and transphobia. Black content creators on social media platforms push conversations on Blackness forward before mass audiences. Some of my favorites show us that how racial ties that bind sometimes strangle. Conscious Lee challenges his audiences and his trolls to engage in research over me search. That is, to think about how power operates both inside of Black communities and outside of Black communities. He pays particular attention to the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality, and he isn't afraid to engage in critical self-reflection when he transgresses boundaries. Meanwhile, female-identified Black studs like Young Easy and Krissa Ace use comedy to call out social norms within Black queer communities that limit the production and performance of gender identities and expressions. Lil Nas X embodies the classic trickster and uses his platform in radical and irreverent ways, simultaneously expanding notions of Black masculinity and engaging and challenging heteronormativity in hypermasculine cultural spaces. Those of us who were born back in the 1900s can take some cues from these young rabble rousers. We must weaponize self-interrogation and self-reflection into individual and collective resistance. For as Michelle Obama wrote in Becoming, it is one thing to get yourself out of a stuck place. It's another thing entirely to try to get the place itself unstuck. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cheney. We have the question and answers section open. So if you have a question, we invite you. Currently, we have one from, I think, a colleague of yours. It's not a question, but a comment from Brett Stockstill, who says, "What's up? He had to go to class, but he wanted to say hi and hope that you all can connect." So just wanted to give you that shout out from your colleague. But the line's open, so please, if you have questions, we will read them here and give you a chance to hear Dr. Cheney's remarks.
So I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm from Kansas, which is where the interest in my work in my research comes from. But I have Illinois roots, and then I went to Northwestern and the University of Illinois. So that's how I know Professor Stockstill, who at the time was a graduate student, and I took a course or two with him, and he was instrumental in kind of shaping my consciousness around these intersections that I talk about. So when I heard, that he's there, I got really excited, even though he told me he had class. So.
Well, this is being recorded, so we'll make sure he gets a copy so he can see you in action. So what about our panelists, Tim, Dr. Wheeler, Dr. Gibson, any questions that we have for Dr. Shea? Oh, we have one here. Here's one. I'm gonna put answered live. I think that's how you all can see it as well. It says, "Thank you, Dr. Cheney. I wonder if you've done any research on the academic achievement of Black students before Brown." Great question.
So one of the chapters of my upcoming book talks about the curriculum of that, Black educators created. It was called of Merit and Achievement. And in that curriculum, students learned about, the history of Africans, the transnational, migration of the transatlantic slave trade. They learned about, the period of enslavement. They learned about, Black contributors to American culture and history and politics. And a number of, I guess one way of answering your question is to think about how these educators shaped the kind of racial subjectivities of Black students in Topeka. And that existed, outside of Topeka, in many, schools throughout the South, regardless of condition. Black educators inculcated, the sense of racial pride and sensibility, in a manner that was like kind of, fortifying young Black students, to go out in the world and against the kind of experiences they would have with anti-Blackness. So to answer your question about the achievements of Black students prior to Brown, I mean, any given figure that you've read about in any of your history books, most of them were educated in Black schools, right? So, whether it be segregated schools throughout the nation or, HBCUs. So I don't do any specific research on their achievements, but again, most of the figures that you read about were educated in Black schools.
Dr. Cheney, in your research, what did you find about the relationships, I guess, between the Black and Brown communities? The ways that, were they working in coalition together, or were there factors tearing them apart? And how did they overcome, if they did overcome?
So racial segregation in Topeka, residential segregation in Topeka was incomplete, but there were segregated public spaces, so there were places where there, that read like no Blacks and no Mexicans allowed. There was a sizable population of people of Mexican descent in Topeka, obviously because of both agriculture and the railroad. So I think I kind of referenced, I did the quotes around dual education system. There were two, it was actually a tripartite system. So there was a Mexican school, and then there were 4 segregated Black schools and 18 white schools. Now, what's interesting, this doesn't directly answer your question, but what is interesting is that in some ways, Black students benefited from the recognition, the political recognition that Black people had in the state of Kansas. So the kind of civil rights laws that existed on the books in Kansas that directly, related to anti-Blackness impacted Black students in a really ironically positive way. So, and also the ways in which Black people were racialized as permanent, which differed from the way in which, people of Mexican of descent were racialized as impermanent. There was a sense that people of Mexican descent could assimilate into whiteness, right? And all they really needed was to be taught in these Spanish schools or these Mexican schools, regardless of whether or not they, their native language was English or Spanish. Those schools, even though students of Mexican descent, regardless of nationality, integrated earlier into white schools, their school was not well maintained. It was, run down. They were taught by white, racist white teachers. They didn't have the benefit of learning about, Mexican culture in the way that Black students had. And Black students didn't integrate until the 9th grade. Students of Mexican descent integrated in the 4th grade. But, their experiences with anti-Latinx racism, had a detrimental impact on students of Mexican descent, many of whom either dropped out earlier than Black students or they went to private schools. There was one Catholic school in town that a lot of parents chose to send their students to. But in any case, there's not like a conversations happening between, say civil rights activists of Mexican descent and Black civil rights activists, but we do see that there is, for example, once the junior high schools were desegregated in 1941, there's a Mexican delegation that went to the school board and asked for them to, disassemble or dismantle the Mexican school, and they won. So, there was no Mexican school. All students of Mexican descent were integrated into predominantly white schools earlier than Black students. But again, it's the way in which the two populations were racialized. It's interesting, there's, anti-Mexican racism in Black communities, there's anti-Black racism in Mexican communities. And there was also like a lot of social exchange that happened within parts of town, the East Topeka, where people lived and, socialized with one another. So I assume it's like, everywhere else in the nation, right? There's both, tensions and coordination in terms of, anti-racism efforts. That's a long answer to your question.
That's a
No,
great
but that was a
answer.
very informative answer. You gave me some other information. I'll be emailing you later.
Okay.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question. The first question was from Dr. Evans, who's our Dean of the College of Education. Her second follow-up question is that we know the number of Black teachers declined after Brown. Were Black educators in Topeka as a group against Brown? And that's her question. Were they against Brown? the Black teachers?
No. Yes. So again, it's a unique situation in which there is relative parity between Black and white schools. It's really like a parallel school system in many ways. And Black educators in the city of Topeka had what I believe is a unique situation in which they were paid on par with white educators. So, teachers were paid according to educational level of attainment. And so, the rumor was there were more teachers with master's degrees in the Black schools than there were in the white schools. You know, I talked about Mamie Williams. Mamie Williams went to Columbia. There were a number of Black women who were teaching in the Black schools who went to Teachers College in Columbia, at Columbia. And again, you know, their pay, they would not have been paid as well if they had been in segregated schools anywhere else in the country. And so on top of this like culture of care that they had for Black students, there's also, right, this recognition of the career limitations that Black people and Black women specifically had, but also that, you know, they would not have these same opportunities if they were anywhere else in the country. So there's this like, I think that there's a relationship between both commitment to Black students and an understanding of their professional limitations outside of Topeka that lent to them to be, you know, Black school preservationists, I call them, you know, against integrating. And they also knew they weren't following Black students in the predominantly white schools. They knew that once schools were integrated, you know, that there would be significant job loss, which did happen, and it happened after junior high schools were integrated in 1941. 6 Black teachers lost their jobs after the Black schools were, Black junior high school students were desegregated in 41.
We have a few more questions. Dr. Miners, this is her question. She really loved this talk, and your response to Dr. Wheeler's question made me wonder about your research. How did white folks in Kansas engage with differences in Black struggles around access to quality and affirming education? I imagine they exploited these differences.
Okay, so let me make sure how do white folks in Kansas engage with differences of Black? So the school board, so white school board members, so whiteness in Kansas is different than whiteness, Southern whites. In fact, you know, white Kansans define their whiteness in juxtaposition of Southern whites, right? So it's like whites in the South are really racist. We're not that. We're like benevolent whites, right? And so even though they were, you know, for example, the white school board were staunch segregationists, they didn't articulate it in very overt ways, right? And so there are ways in which, you know, Black people could negotiate getting certain benefits within their schools, or negotiate certain things that they felt were missing in Black schools by, you know, kind of exploiting this idea that whites in Kansas had, that they were not like Southern whites, right? And so that's part of how they get, you know, this parallel school system. So when they saw that something was missing, they say, you know, listen, you know, schools are supposed to be separate. You want us to be separate. We need to be equal. You know, give us a school nurse, or, you know, we need more buses or whatever, right? On the ground, you know, there's a mixture of you know, sentiments around Black inclusion into predominantly white schools. When the schools were initially segregated in 1929, you know, there were white people who were happy about it. Obviously, there are people who were, you know, extremely racist, and there are people who you know, there were interrelations between Blacks and whites in Topeka. Folks would spend the night at each other's houses, watch each other kids, you know, have dinner with one another. And so, you know, there are just pockets of, that's why I say, you know, it's interesting to think about like diversity within, you know, manifestations of anti-Black racism, right? Because it's not all the same either. And there are definitely regional specificities to it. So I would say, you know, there's a spectrum of responses to segregated schools among whites.
Thank you. We have another question from Michelle Ludwig. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Do you feel that Mendes versus Westminster had an impact on the desegregation of schools in Topeka?
It had an impact on the desegregation of schools throughout the US, right? Because, you know, that case is what, you know, Thurgood Marshall became inspired by this idea that segregated schools impacted the psychological well-being of students who were forced to go to these segregated schools. So this is where the idea of like, we need to combat school segregation based off of, the psychological, detriment of students who are forced to be segregated. That's all from Westminster versus Mendez versus Westminster. So, bringing in Kenneth Clark and the doll test, this is all like related to that case. So I would say, that I find, so, I'm an ethnic studies scholar too. So, I find these conversations around and histories that, look at, the comparative and relational approach to understanding these different like racial dynamics throughout the country. So for me, like Mendez versus Westminster is really interesting too, because it's this place in California in which, initially was populated by a number of Japanese farmers who were incarcerated, right? During World War II, and in their place you have this immigration of Mexican and farmers and people who are of Mexican descent who are then forced to go to these Spanish speaking schools, who then challenge racial segregation in schools, which sparks the imagination of Thurgood Marshall, and then you have Brown, right? So it's all like related.
Powerful, thank you. The last is, it's more a little bit more of what you've spoken about, but I do want to acknowledge a question by Sharday Arnold. Thank you, Dr. Shaney. Based on your research, is it safe to say that most Black people in Topeka were against integration? And did you see a decline in Black student success? So maybe a more focus on what was the impact on Black students.
So I don't study the post-Brown era. That was what I went into this research doing. I was like, what happened to Blacks after Brown? Because I grew up again in Topeka. So I remember like quota systems in social activities in high school. And so I was kind of like interested in looking at that. From the oral histories of people who went to both schools, we see that there definitely is a negative impact on the desire of Black students to stay in school. You do see a small spike in students who are dropping out, but that also happened prior to Brown, because again, you had Black students who went to all Black schools and having these affirming experiences with Black teachers, who are integrating into white junior high schools and white high schools, where they're experiencing the stigmatization of their peers and racism of white teachers. So to answer your question, I would say the experiences that Blacks, you see this all across the country too. It's just the experience of people of African descent in public education system has not rebounded in many places throughout the country. And it's not that we can say that we've had complete desegregation, obviously, either. I think one of the lessons to be learned from this particular moment, and I don't try to extract a lot of lessons from this particular moment, because the environment was really unique in the sense that you did have well-paid, Black educators and administrators. You had, modern structures. Students were going to school and, structures that were built in the 1920s. They shared the curriculum with white students. It's a very unique kind of situation. But I think what we can see there is that when Black students have teachers, regardless of race, who are invested in their well-being and their total well-being, who have a holistic approach to the child, we see student success, right? It's when we have a disinvestment in the well-being, the psychological, emotional, educational well-being of Black students that we see, problems, I think, within the public education system. And we have not seen that level of investment in large part in the public school system, I would say.
Thank you. I agree with that 100%. This final question I think we have here is from Dr. Lori Fuller. Many of the icons of desegregation movement are women. Can you talk about gender and how that played a role in Topeka?
So yeah, I mean, the majority of Black educators were women. Lucinda Todd, who was one of the kind of three architects of Brown, became politicized as a mother of a daughter who was who went to segregated schools and she felt was being discriminated against. I think what's interesting about the Topeka case that, which is why I'm writing about it, is that a lot of the political engagement happens in the subterranean, right? So there's not a lot of documentation on, how these Black school preservationists fought to maintain, all Black schools. But what we see is that they're using social spaces in using social relationships, sometimes in very unscrupulous ways, to undermine civil rights activists. So for example, Lucinda Todd was no longer invited to certain social circles that she had been a part of before. Black ministers could not get on board with Brown and Topeka because they had, sizable populations of Black professionals, particularly Black educators, who were resistant to, desegregating schools. So what you see is, a lot of phone calls, phone harassment, intimidation in the streets, taking out, some of their frustrations on the children of civil rights activists. Some of those children, in their memoirs talk about teachers who ignored them in the classroom or, who would throw shade at them, on the playground or whatever. So, but these are ways in which women were organizing, particularly Black female educators were organizing and mobilizing using social weapons, right? Ostracization and so on and so forth. Those aren't seen in the public record. That's not like I'm sending a letter to the national NAACP saying that I don't want segregation. That's not what happened, right? But the records that we see tend to be that level of correspondence or people who are, essentially NAACP records are really the kind of key source for understanding what was going on in Topeka at that time. And in those records, you see them talking about Black teachers are creating a problem for us in Topeka, and that's why we can't get people to sign on as plaintiffs in Brown versus Board of Education.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to state that we put a link for everyone. This is a link to the Kellogg Foundation. Today is, they designate it as the Day for Racial Healing. And it's a link that we're putting out there that has some resources for folks to do just what you're saying, Dr. Shaney, for teachers, really for educators to build a classroom where there is a real community of care and healing involved in that, and really understanding race and racism and how it plays out in our communities and schools. So that link is there for everyone to access, and will be part of our series that we continue with the Pedroso Center. Let's see. And so we just have a lot of thank yous and a lot of appreciations coming in from folks that are listening from our students in our community. Again, any closing thoughts you want to leave us with here? I want to hand the floor back over to you, Dr. Shaney.
Oh, I'm just really appreciative of the invitation to come and share my work with you and to talk about, the ways in which we, memorialize certain figures and certain historical moments, and to really question why certain people and events get, highlighted over others, and how that serves a certain historical narrative. And so I appreciate, again, the opportunity to get to talk about that.
Thank you again so much for your time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tim, for, really grounding us in freedom and your beautiful words. thank you everyone for being here tonight, and I hope everyone